They built pyramids aligned to the path of Venus. They tracked the planets across the sky with a precision that should not have been possible, and they ran a calendar that counted time across millions of years. A people who could read the heavens this closely should have seen anything coming. And then, more than 1,000 years ago, their cities fell silent. The temples emptied. The carving stopped mid-stroke. That is the problem at the center of this story. A civilization this advanced should have left a clear answer behind it, and it left almost none. So I went looking for how the Maya collapsed, and I found a stranger question waiting underneath it. Where did these people come from, and where did they actually go? The answer was never carved into a temple or painted on a wall. It was buried in their bones, and the bones have finally started to speak. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what these people built, because the scale of it still feels impossible. The golden age of the Maya ran from roughly 250 to 900 in the Common Era, and across those centuries, they raised a world that has no business belonging to the ancient past. They built great cities studded with temples and palaces, broad public plazas, and stone ball courts where a sacred game was played. The pyramids still stand. You can walk among them today at Chichen Itza, at Tikal, at Palenque, at Tulum, rising out of the jungle like something left behind by a vanished god. And the engineering is where it stops feeling ancient at all. At Chichen Itza, there is a structure we call El Caracol, a rounded tower perched high above the forest canopy. It looks almost like a modern observatory, and in a sense, that is exactly what it was. Its lines appear to track the movements of Venus across the sky. These were people who watched the heavens not as a hobby, but as a sacred duty, because they believed the motion of the planets was bound up with the will of the gods. Out of that obsession came the calendars, and here the Maya outdid almost everyone. They ran 2 calendars at once, one woven into the other, and beyond them a third system called the long count, that reckoned time not in years but in vast cycles stretching across millions of years. You have probably heard that this calendar predicted the end of the world in the year 2012. It did not. A single great cycle happened to close on a date in December of that year, and a great many people who longed for an apocalypse decided that meant the end of everything. The Maya themselves had units of time that ran far, far past it. The world was never supposed to stop. The counting simply rolled over and carried on. They wrote too. The Maya developed a full hieroglyphic script, a dense and beautiful system of symbols that they pressed onto stone and painted into books, and for centuries no one alive could read a word of it. It was only in the last 100 years that scholars finally broke it open and began to hear these people speak in their own voice, and even now much of their world remains shrouded. We are still learning who they were. So picture it whole. A people who mapped the planets, who measured time across millions of years, who built towering cities in the heart of the jungle and wrote their history across every wall and monument they raised. A civilization this sophisticated, this literate, this precise, should be the easiest in all of history to explain. We should be able to name its kings, trace its origins, and say plainly why it fell. And it is one of the hardiest puzzles the ancient world has ever handed us. We can climb their pyramids and stand in their plazas and read the dates they carved into stone, and we still cannot say for certain why their cities went quiet. A people who left us so much should not be a mystery at all. So where did they truly come from, and where did they go? To answer that, you have to begin long before the first pyramid ever rose. Begin where the evidence begins, which is in the ground, thousands of years before the first city stood. The trail runs back to around 1500 BCE in what is now Guatemala, southern Mexico, and parts of Belize. People settled there, and they stayed. They planted maize, beans, and squash. Small villages took shape around those fields, the way villages always do. around the work of feeding people and the slow business of staying alive in one place. This was not a camp or a passing stop. It was the beginning of something that would not vanish for more than 2,000 years. And from those first villages, the story moves forward slowly, with no single dramatic turn. The Maya learned to work the land with real intelligence. They built irrigation, they carved terraces into the hillsides, and they coaxed more out of the soil than it should have given. As the villages grew, the work inside them began to divide. People stopped doing a little of everything and started doing one thing well. Some made pottery, some worked stone, some carved. This is the quiet engine of complexity, because when people specialize, they must trade. And when they trade, they must organize. And out of that, organizing a more intricate society is born. But the Maya were not alone out there. They lived alongside the Olmec, long regarded as the first great mother culture of the region, the people everyone assumed had taught the rest. For a long time, the story was simple. The Olmec came first, and the Maya were their students. Then the ground began to tilt. A husband and wife team of archaeologists, Takeshi Inomata and Daniela Triadan, spent years excavating the ancient city of Ciibal, which had been thought to be almost entirely inspired by the Olmec center of Leventa. When they ran radiocarbon dating on the oldest structures they found at Ceibal, the dates came back wrong for the old story. Cephal predated the oldest construction at Leventa by 200 years, so the Olmec were not the mother of the Maya after all. The two seem to have risen side by side, and many scholars now believe the neat lines we drew between these peoples were never real to begin with. What likely happened is that many small Mesoamerican societies began developing at once after maize agriculture took hold, borrowing from one another, influencing one another, blending into something larger. Hold on to that idea, because it is the first quiet hint of what this whole story turns out to be. Not a single people with a single origin, but a fusion. And here's the part that matters most. There was no invasion that brought the Maya into being. No conquering people swept in to plant a civilization in foreign soil. As far as the archaeology can show, the Maya grew out of the ground beneath them. The cities are the descendants of the villages. The villages are the descendants of those first maize farmers. It rose in place slowly over thousands of years of patient continuity, and that should settle the question of where these people came from. They came from here. They were always here. But the soil can only tell you so much. Deep roots explain the cities and the maize and the long unbroken thread of settlement. They cannot tell you who the people actually were. For that, you cannot dig any deeper. You have to read the genome. Reading the genome of the Maya is harder than it sounds, and for a long time it was simply impossible. Ancient genetic material is fragile, and the hot, wet climate of Mesoamerica is close to the worst environment on Earth for preserving it. Heat and moisture break the molecule down until nothing usable is left. So, for decades, there was a strange silence at the center of the story. The temples and the carvings and the bones piled up in their thousands, and the genetic material inside those bones said nothing at all. Then the silence broke. In May 2025, researchers published the genomes of 7 people buried at Copan, an ancient Maya capital in what is now western Honduras. Among the 7 were a man who appears to have been a dynastic ruler, buried in a royal tomb, and another individual who seems to have been offered in sacrifice. It was a thin thread of evidence pulled out of a near-hopeless climate, and what it showed quietly rearranged the whole story. The first thing the bones revealed was depth. The genetic signal at Copan runs back in an unbroken line to the late Archaic period, roughly 3,700 years before the Common Era, and it runs forward without breaking all the way to the 7 million Maya alive today. These were not newcomers. They were the descendants of the oldest inhabitants of the land, a thread of ancestry stretching across more than 5,000 years. But there was a second signal woven through the first. Around the height of the Maya world, a new strand of ancestry arrives, a flow of roughly 6% traced to the highlands of Mexico, far to the north. It is the biological fingerprint of outsiders moving in, and it lines up with something the inscriptions had been telling us all along. The royal dynasty of Copan was founded in the year 426 by a man named Kinich Yaxcook Mo, and the carvings record him as an outsider, his monuments echoing the distant power of Teotihuacan. For centuries, that was just a story carved in stone. Now the genome gives that story a bloodline. The rulers really did come from elsewhere, and they married into the people they came to lead. So the question we had been asking all along, where did the Maya come from, was the wrong question. The answer was never a single homeland or a single migrating tribe. It was a blend, formed in place, out of streams of ancestry that met in the same valleys and mixed across generations. That is exactly why the origin never had a clean answer. There was no clean origin to find. It is worth being honest about the limits here. This is 7 genomes from one city, not 1,000 from across the whole Maya world. The bones are scarce, the picture is still a thread rather than a full tapestry, and a handful of skeletons cannot speak for every kingdom. But the shape of the answer has changed. The Maya were not strangers who landed on an empty shore. They were what happened when several peoples met and merged into something new. And there is one more thing the genome recorded, the thing that matters most of all. Buried in the same data is a sharp collapse in the population around 1,200 years ago. Hold on to that. It is the loaded fact that will explain everything that came next. Look at what that fusion built, because the world it made was not what most people imagine. We tend to picture the Maya as one great empire, a single crown ruling from a single throne. They were nothing of the kind. The Maya world was a scatter of competing city-states, closer to the old Greek model than to Rome. Dozens of kingdoms that traded with one another, married into one another, and went to war with one another. Each city had its own ruler, an Aja, and the Aja was no mere governor. He stood at the meeting point of the human world and the divine, and part of his sacred duty was to keep the gods satisfied so that the rains would come and the maize would grow. Hold on to that, because it is the thread that will unravel later. To understand why the gods mattered so much, you have to understand the world the Maya believed they lived in. Above them stretched a layered heaven. Below them waited an underworld of 9 descending levels, a place called Xibalba, ruled by lords of death, through which the souls of the dead were forced to pass. It was a frightening cosmos, and almost everything the Maya did was bent toward keeping the right side of it. Even their games were sacred. Across the Maya world, archaeologists have found ball courts shaped like a great capital letter Y, some of them longer than a modern football field. The game played there was not just sport, it was bound to their deepest myths, an echo of a contest played by the hero twins of their sacred story, a reenactment of the eternal struggle between light and darkness. And it could turn deadly. Running beneath the game and beneath the temples was the dark thread of human sacrifice, blood offered up to feed the gods and hold the cosmos in balance. The rulers carried that weight into death itself. At Palenque, the great king Pakal was entombed inside his own pyramid, laid to rest with jade and treasure, and accompanied by the bodies of human beings sacrificed to follow him into the next world. A Maya king did not die alone. But not every settlement bowed to a god king. In a village called Seren, in what is now El Salvador, a volcanic eruption around 600 in the Common Era buried the whole community in ash and froze it in time. When archaeologists dug it out, they found no palace, no ruling elite, no sign of a lord at all. It seems to have been a community that governed itself, a reminder that the Maya world held more than one way of living. Still, the God King was the rule, and that fact carried a hidden danger. Power among the Maya rested on a promise. The Ajah kept the gods content, and in return the gods kept the people fed. It was a contract written into the very structure of their society. And a contract like that is only as strong as the harvest. So long as the rains came and the fields gave their maize, the king was divine, the order held, and the cities thrived. But a ruler who stood between his people and the gods was also a ruler who could be blamed when the gods went quiet. This was a world held together by belief and by rain, and both of them were about to fail. The disappearance did not begin with a catastrophe. It began with a slow fading. There was no single fire, no final battle, no day the Maya world ended. Instead, the collapse crept across the land over the better part of a century, striking different regions at different times. It seems to have begun around Pitex Batoon and spread outward across the Usumacinta River, kingdom by kingdom, like a light going out one room at a time. And in some places, the end was eerily abrupt. At a city called Bonampak, the walls carry gorgeous painted murals, scenes of a ruler in his moment of triumph. And then the artwork simply stops. There are half-finished sketches still visible today, work the painters clearly meant to complete. They never came back. At Aguateca, builders were carving a temple when something interrupted them. The stone had been smoothed and made ready for its inscriptions, and the inscriptions were never cut. And in the final years before these places emptied, the people threw up defensive walls and palisades, as though they knew something was coming. So, what was coming? The theories have multiplied for a century, so let us take them one at a time. The first is overpopulation. At its height, the great city of Tikal may have held around 50,000 people, and with the tools and the farming methods of the age, that many mouths in one place put enormous strain on the land. The second theory turns that strain into a crisis, and the evidence for it is strong. Researchers studying sediment cores from Lake Chichankanab, led by Nicholas Evans, measured the chemistry locked in the layers of mud and reconstructed the ancient climate. What they found was drought, not a single dry spell, but recurring droughts stretching across 400 years, with rainfall falling by as much as 41 to 54% for long stretches. And the worst of it lined up precisely with the moment the Maya population reached its peak. The most people the land had ever held, meeting the least water it had ever given. The cruel part is that the Maya may have helped bring the drought down on themselves. To feed their growing cities, they practiced slash and burn farming, clearing vast tracts of forest for fields, for fuel, for building. Strip away the trees on that scale, and the land grows hotter and drier. The very thing that fed them was poisoning the rains they depended on. Then came war. Texts from the 9th century record conflict between cities far more often than before. The royal family of one city, Cancuin, was massacred around the year 800. Armies on the move cut the trade routes, and a world that ran on barter began to starve. And here the religion turns deadly. When the rains failed and the maize withered, the Ajah who had promised to keep the gods content stood exposed as a man who could not. Some cities may not have been emptied by invaders at all, but abandoned by their own people, the rulers cast down for failing the one duty that made them divine. There is one stubborn complication. In the north, Chichen Itza and Uxmal flourished for another 1.5 centuries before they too fell, and no one fully knows why. But the verdict on the whole is clear. This was no single killer. It was a system collapsing under its own weight. And yet, here is the thing the silent cities hide, and the bones reveal. Now remember the fact we parked at the start, the one buried in the genome. The bones from Kopon recorded a sharp collapse in the population around 1,200 years ago. That is real. It is not a guess or a theory drawn from broken pottery. It is written into the genetic record itself, the unmistakable signature of a people whose numbers crashed. The drought, the warfare, the failing kings, all of it left its mark, not just in the ruins, but in the bloodline. Something terrible did happen here. The DNA confirms it. But the same genome recorded something the ruins could never show. Run the thread of that ancestry forward through the collapse, through the silent cities and the abandoned temples, and it does not break. It carries straight through. The people whose numbers fell so sharply did not vanish from the record. Their descendants kept living, kept having children, kept passing that ancient signal down all the way to the present day. So now the two witnesses speak together and they agree. The archaeology says the cities emptied, the carving stopped, the kingdoms went quiet. The genome says the people did not die. One tells you the civilization fell. The other tells you the civilization fell, and the Maya survived it. The graves say the cities ended. The DNA says the people did not. This was never an extinction. The Maya were not wiped out, not ethnically cleansed, not erased by some plague that emptied the land. The smallpox that devastated them came much later, carried by the Spanish, centuries after the cities had already gone quiet. The collapse itself killed no people in that final sense. The urban experiment ended, and the people did what their world had always allowed them to do. They left. They dissolved back into the countryside, into the villages and the maize fields that had been the true foundation all along, long before the first pyramid ever rose. The cities had only ever sat on top of that older world. When the cities failed, the older world was still there, still waiting, and the people simply returned to it. And they are still there now. An estimated 7 million people identify as Maya today. They live across Guatemala and Belize, across Honduras and El Salvador, across the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. They still speak Mayan languages, often alongside the Spanish that was later forced upon them. They still farm the land their ancestors farmed. They still carry their ancestors' names. The bloodline that the genome traced back more than 5,000 years did not end with the cities. It walked out of them and kept going. It would be a clean and comforting place to stop, but honesty does not allow it. The descendants of the Maya have not been left in peace. In many of the countries where they live, they face heavy discrimination, sometimes violent. During the long civil war in Guatemala, which dragged on for 36 years, the people murdered and assaulted in the greatest numbers were overwhelmingly Maya. The civilization that survived drought and warfare and the fall of its own kings has had to survive the centuries that came after as well. The cities fell silent more than 1,000 years ago. The struggle of the people who built them never quite did. Here is the thing that stays with me after weeks inside this material. The story of the Maya is almost always told as a vanishing. A brilliant people who built impossible cities, who mapped the planets and measured time across millions of years, and then simply evaporated, leaving only ruins and a calendar the world misread. The DNA tells a different story. It tells of a people who were never a single origin at all, but a fusion formed in place, which is exactly why their beginning never had a clean answer. And it tells of a civilization that did not die so much as dissolve. The rains failed, the kings lost the gods, the cities fell silent, but the bloodline ran on, unbroken, into the millions of Maya alive right now. So they were never strangers who arrived, and they never truly left. They were here all along, and a part of them is here still.